I'm willing to say he's the basement coach of the year.
It's 2 games. They got to get something rolling.
This is the Sports Saga podcast, and it's presented by Aldias Electric. Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. Wherever you're watching or listening, please like, share, subscribe, leave us your feedback, follow us on social media. Do all that using the link tree in the description below. Brady Kudo with 2 co-hosts today, Tyler Clark, y'all know him well, and Dylan Johnston making his debut. And our guest today is a do-it-all play-by-play man for ESPN. His name is Mike Couzens. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. And most importantly, how are you?
I am great. And like Dylan, happy to be on for the first time.
All right. So let's get right into this. You obviously have been at ESPN now since 2012. So take us through your pre-ESPN career. I was reading you called some minor league baseball.
Yeah, so my baseball play-by-play career, believe it or not, started in Massachusetts. After my freshman year of college, I started in the Cape Cod Baseball League in 2008.
Nice.
And came back there in 2009. I was with the Falmouth Commodores. Okay. And in the first stroke of many strokes of luck in my career, I had no baseball play-by-play experience prior to that summer of 2008. It was after my first year of college. Syracuse does not have a baseball team. So I had never broadcast a baseball game before, but I grew up as a huge baseball fan, listening to the Mets on the radio. And so I knew that I wanted to go to the Cape League and try and get some play-by-play experience under my belt. So I reached out to every team there. Most of them did not get back to me. Falmouth did. And it was a gentleman by the name of Pat Loftus, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. He had just retired from a job working in finance in New York City and wanted to volunteer with a team. And they had an opening for volunteers in the broadcast position. And he knew of a broadcaster by the name of Dan Duva, who's currently the radio play-by-play broadcaster for the Las Vegas Knights. And Dan and a friend of his were the first Cape League broadcasters in Chatham back in the early to mid 2000s. I don't know the exact year. So Pat Loftus, who eventually hired me, reached out to Dan and said, "Hey, I know you had gone to Syracuse. Do you have any recommendations of anybody from Syracuse for this internship that I'm trying to find people for?" It just so happens that I emailed Pat the next day. So Pat operated under the assumption that I had been recommended by Dan when I had very much not been recommended by Dan. I had no play-by-play experience. I don't know that Pat knew that it's generally the thing you do is you also send along a tape of your work. He didn't ask me for any baseball play-by-play, which was great because I didn't have any baseball play-by-play to send along. And so I got in there and I did that in 2008 and 2009. And then in the summer of 2010, after my junior year of college, I applied for an internship with the team then known as the Syracuse Chiefs. They're now the Syracuse Mets, a AAA team in Syracuse, New York, where I went to school. And the broadcaster who hired me there is Jason Benetti. And Jason hired me to be the pregame and postgame host and maybe do a couple of in-game updates on scores around the league, that kind of deal. As it turned out, every other person he tried to get for the number 2 announcer position fell through. And so about a month before the season starts, he goes, "All right, well, you've got experience. You're going to be the number 2 announcer." And so I did play-by-play on almost every game that year, along with Jason, who did the majority of the innings. And then I graduated from school in December of 2010. And my first job professionally after being out of college was with the Reds single-A team in Dayton, Ohio, the Dayton Dragons. When that season was over, my job ended and I needed another one. So I moved to Burlington, Vermont, and I was the women's basketball announcer on the radio for the University of Vermont. And then my final job before ESPN, where I was for almost 3 full seasons, was in Fort Wayne, Indiana, with the Fort Wayne Tin Caps, which are the Class A affiliate of the San Diego Padres.
Vermont.
That was a whirlwind journey you just took us on.
Yeah, to say that. But what I like is that this is a theme that, like, I haven't seen a lot of announcers. A couple of the announcers that I've interviewed, you're like, for the most part, in one area of the country.
And that was just by luck. I understood going into this that I might have had to move to Great Falls, Montana. I might have had to go to Modesto, California. There's a lot of places that I could have ended up going. I'm very fortunate that all of them were within a day's drive, because I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 hours to go from Burlington, Vermont to Fort Wayne, Indiana, but nothing was ever too far away. And so I got very lucky in that regard.
Still a lot of moving and not a lot of time. So I mean, this is slightly off track, but I'm actually very interested in this. Did you just have to sign like monthly rent agreements when you were moving to these places? Because that's a lot of move. That's like 3 significant moves in less than a year, really.
So the 2 summers on the Cape, the first one, I had a friend whose family let me stay at a place, which was if you're familiar with the geography of the Cape, I was in Falmouth, which is like here.
I'm very familiar. Yeah.
And they had a place in West Yarmouth, which was about here. So I spent a lot of time on Route 28 driving back and forth.
Oh, yeah.
And spent a lot of money on gas that summer. The summer of 2009, I rented a room out of a house off of Craigslist. And then when I moved to Dayton in 2011, I was able to get an apartment complex that was kind enough to give me a 6-month lease. And then when I moved to Burlington, Vermont, I found another room off of Craigslist with a woman who had 2 dogs that did not like me very much. So I stayed in my room quite a bit. And I didn't have many possessions at the time, had no furniture. And so the bed that I slept on in Burlington was an air mattress from Bed Bath & Beyond, which I'm sure everybody at some point in their life has gotten the 20% off Bed Bath & Beyond coupon in the mail. Yep. So I bought the air mattress with the 20% off coupon. And then at the end of my time there, I went back to the store to return it. And I got the full refund for the full purchase price of the mattress. So I actually made money giving back my air mattress to Bed Bath & Beyond.
That's a great story. That's.
I hope the statute of limitations has expired on that.
I would think so.
Yeah, Dylan.
So, Mike, we know you can do it all. You can broadcast anything. But what is your favorite to broadcast?
I think whatever season I'm in. I know you guys talked to Andrew Catalon, and he had the similar answer.
Yes.
But that's part of the appeal of the way that my job works now, is that I went from being a team broadcaster I did 5 seasons of minor league baseball, and that's in the neighborhood of 140 to 150 games a year. And now I have a season that lasts maybe 3 to 4 months, whether it's college football, then it goes into college basketball, and then wrestling, and then baseball and softball. And so I love the variety of it because it's always ever-changing storylines. It's always different people. I think one of the more challenging aspects of being a team broadcaster is that, especially for baseball, with as long of a season as it is, if your team is really bad, if you're the Baltimore Orioles, for instance, going into that season, the odds are heavily against your team appearing in the postseason. And so for me, I always like the aspect of having a chase of something exciting, some type of thrill to look forward to. And even when I was in Vermont, the basketball team only won 10 games. The people were great, but it's a shorter season. Baseball is really long. And so I love it all. And I've gotten to expand my portfolio of sports that I do. This is now my 4th year of calling college softball, which has quickly become one of my favorite sports. Prior to coming to ESPN, I had never had any involvement with college wrestling, and I really love college wrestling. And this past summer, for the first time, on the day where ESPN has the Ocho Day in August.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
That's what I love that. I love when they do that.
All types of obscure sports. I broadcast World Chase Tag, which was really fun and totally different. And I knew nothing about that either. So I love to learn about new stuff and have the variety in things.
What was the chase tag like? Now you got to explain. What was the chase tag like?
So chase tag is a sport that was invented over in the UK by these 2 brothers who built basically this contraption. It's called the quad, and they built it in their backyard, and it's got all these different obstacles on it. And I want to say it's about 40 feet by 40 feet. And I think it's a 20-second round where there's a chaser and an evader. And the only way you can score a point is by evading the chaser, which is very difficult to do. And so it's a lot of athletes who come from parkour and from tumbling and gymnastics backgrounds. And it's a very high energy because it's 20-second bursts on, and then the next guy step up, and then it's 20 more seconds. So I was almost felt like I was screaming the whole time, and I was sweating by the end of it. But it's super fun because it's unlike anything else, and the athleticism is really insane. And I just had a blast doing it.
See, that sounds really fun. It's really interesting. Like, again, talking and seeing different announcers who do a sport outside of their comfort zone. like we were talking to John Fanta actually earlier from Fox, and he was like, I'm calling women's lacrosse next week. And he said, I've never done lacrosse before. So again, it's really interesting to see who steps out of their comfort zone. And you mentioned that college wrestling is starting to get in your comfort zone. I did see you worked with Daniel Cormier for those events. So I want to know, again, he's your partner. Do you have a favorite partner or like a notable partner, someone who's maybe helped you grow as a play-by-play?
Well, Daniel, first, we had never met before we did the NCAA Wrestling Championships this year, and you could not ask for a better partner. Daniel is so nice. He's gregarious. He's knowledgeable. He's funny. He's insanely energetic and brings so much to the broadcast. So he was great to work with. Somebody who really helped me out very early on in my career and is a very good friend of mine is Paul Biancardi, who is the ESPN Director of High School Basketball Recruiting. And before I came on full time with ESPN, the primary thing that I was doing was their high school basketball package, which, a guy who's done it in the past before me is Joe Davis, who's now the voice of baseball on Fox in the World Series. And Paul was just so welcoming and so kind to me and has become one of my really good friends. And we actually, I just moved to Charlotte around Christmas. We live about 10 minutes away from each other now.
Oh, that's funny.
So he's always been happy to introduce me to new people within basketball and make a connection for me if I ever need one. He was great. A guy I worked with for a long time on college basketball too is Corey Alexander, who is super easygoing, very funny. He was there with me on the game where I proposed to my wife at the Carrier Dome in Syracuse. So he'll always have a special place in our hearts. And then this past season, I worked with Dustin Fox on college football, who Dustin spent a lot of time working on ESPN3 games before getting to what we call linear or airing on a TV network. And Dustin and I lived, when I moved from Cleveland, Dustin lives up in that area and does a sports talk radio show. So we didn't live very far apart from one another. And he's also super high energy and can talk about anything. And so there's so many great people who I've worked with, but those are just some who really stand out.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk to you about what just possessed you to say, you know what, I'm going to propose to my girlfriend at work. That's unheard of. Like what? Why did you do that?
So I think it boils down to a couple of things. One is that it was kind of home territory because I went to Syracuse. So I knew a lot of people at the Carrier Dome.
Yeah.
And two, my sense of frugality also, because, if you're going to do a proposal, you want to have somebody there who's going to take pictures, who's going to do video, whatever the case might be. You got to pay those people. Well, I was friendly enough with a few of the people who worked for the Syracuse Post-Standard and the Syracuse Athletics Department who were already there working the game just to shoot the basketball part of it. So I said, well, hey, if you wouldn't mind sticking around for like 5 or 10 more minutes after the game is over, I'm going to be proposing to my girlfriend. I would love if you could get a couple pictures. So I probably saved a few $100 that way. But the seats too that my wife was sitting in, I'm looking at, we have a picture of it on the wall right behind the broadcast position. Those are high dollar seats. A friend of mine who graduated a year ahead of me, her dad has those tickets. So I was able to ask her if he wouldn't mind allowing my then girlfriend to sit with him for the game, and so that she could be there and we could just have her swoop in right when the game was over. As it happens, there was, shock, in January, a huge snowstorm in Syracuse. Oh. So she was supposed to fly in. This game was a Saturday afternoon game. She was supposed to fly in Friday after work from Cleveland to go through Newark, New Jersey, and up to Syracuse. And all of her flights got canceled. And so I couldn't make it seem too urgent that she get there because that would kind of give the game away. So I said, you know what, just try and come in Saturday morning first thing. And if you make it, you make it. If you don't, you don't. And so she finally made it to the game in the second half. But once I knew she was on the ground, I knew I was in pretty good shape. So I had the ring in my backpack waiting and ready to go. I wanted something that was also sentimental for both of us that would give her a tie to the university, because she did not go to Syracuse and had never been to the Carrier Dome before. And I wanted it to mean something to her like it meant something to me. And so all of those things really worked out perfectly. And thank goodness they did, because I did not and still have never thought of a plan B.
Me talking with John earlier, I'm just relating because we talked to him a little while ago. He also said he didn't have a plan B. For me, now granted, I'm in high school. I don't have a plan B. I started announcing Tyler. Tyler got me my first job. I was 13. And he'll tell you, I don't have a plan B. I don't. That
was my best idea. I'm not an ideas guy. That was one of my most creative days ever.
So that's a memorable moment. That's obviously a memorable moment. Do you have any other memorable like in-game moments that you call any, piece of history? Do you have a favorite or a best call, you would say, or something that, you look back on like, that was really good?
The moment that stands out to me the most was in 2018 at the NCAA Wrestling Championships in Cleveland. Penn State right now is on this dynastic run. I think they've won 9 of the last 11 team championships.
Wow.
So it's kind of like UConn women's basketball was not all that long ago. And wrestling is a 3-day championship. So you start with 330 wrestlers. The final night you go in with 20 and you emerge with 10 individual champions. And so it was a very tight team race between Penn State and Ohio State. And I want to say it was maybe the 7th or 8th match of the night. And a wrestler by the name of Bo Nickel picks up a pin, which locks up the team championship as far as the total score goes. And the Penn State fans travel really well. It was just, one state over. And the place just went nuts. It was the loudest I've ever heard any building I've ever been in. Wow. And so I've never done this before and I haven't done it since. I just took my headset off and I looked around the building and I just kind of soaked in the moment, because I think those are things that, unless you're at some type of huge arena concert and everybody's singing the same song, you don't get that in a lot of sports. Because in wrestling, it's unique in that people cheer for wrestlers that are not from their school, because there are so many schools that are involved and they're just happy for the moment. Because if you've ever wrestled or been around wrestling, you know just how difficult of a sport it is. In no other sport do you have to really regulate what you eat and drink as much as you do in wrestling. It's a true physical dedication. And so it was really cool to me and kind of remains the pinnacle of a moment that gives me chills.
I didn't realize there were 3 days. That's a lot.
Well, you start with 330 wrestlers and it's a double elimination format. So there's a lot of action that goes on over the course of 3 days.
So how many matches would you say you could take 2022, for example? How many matches did you call per day?
I don't know that I have a real answer for that, because what we do on day 1 is we do a quad box or a double box. So we'll do either 2 or 4 matches at once, and we'll do our coverage a little bit like golf as well, where since there's 8 mats going at once, we might say, hey, moments ago on mat 2, here's what happened. So they've got that queued up on the replay machine. So it's not as though we stay with a match for the full 7-minute duration all the time. And then on Friday night, the second night, we're in the semifinals. So there's only 2 going at one time. And then the Saturday is the championship round. So it's a lot, but I don't know that there's a specific number I could give you.
Oh, all right. I had never seen the wrestling championships. I just know that it was hard, and it's hard to wrestle. Obviously, I'm never gonna do it. I have no interest in that. So I should not be, but I am out of questions. Tyler, Dylan, any last
minute thoughts? I have a time for this. So Mike, I know you've done a lot of games over the first game any sport you ever did, and like what moments for that?
So I remember the first time I went to go make a tape. A friend of mine named Andrew, who is the play-by-play broadcaster at Vanderbilt University, and he invited me down to the Carrier Dome to broadcast. So I just took some scissors and I cut out of the newspaper what I thought was relevant information, and I took Scotch tape and I just put it into a notebook of mine, and I used that as my preparation for how to call the game. granted, I had no idea what I was doing as to any of the dynamics of how it worked and what you're supposed to say and when you're supposed to say it or any of that stuff. So
Yeah.
I felt like I was wasting his time because he was older than me and I felt like he really knew what he was doing. But we were both just getting our sea legs basically doing that. Baseball, I don't particularly remember. And so I hope that the tapes of those games have been erased or burned somewhere. Wrestling, I was definitely very nervous about it because you want to make sure that you have, we all grow up watching football and basketball and baseball, but not as much wrestling. And so you want to make sure you have all the lingo of that down. I do remember doing my first broadcast when we at Syracuse, we called it, you got cleared to air when you were allowed to actually go on the radio and call a game. And it was during the holiday break between semesters of my sophomore year. And so a buddy of mine who lived north of me, we drove down from just outside New York City to Georgetown, and we broadcast a Syracuse women's basketball game there. And I have no doubt that we got off the air feeling like we had really crushed it. And I also have no doubt that if we listened back to that tape today, we would think it's entirely terrible. So it's fun to see how much we've progressed over time and how much having repetitions helps. And a lot of people will say, well, yeah, you just need reps to get better. But like anything else, you need good reps to get better. And so one of the things that I loved about our culture at Syracuse is what makes everybody improve is that everybody is out there to help each other. And so when I talked about my friend Andrew, who is a year older than me, asking me to come make a tape with him, he was looking to get me better. And we would all listen back to each other's work and critique each other and help each other get better. So I really appreciated that aspect of it because it was competitive, but it was a friendly competition.
Dylan, any last minute thoughts?
Yeah, I have one question. So as you broadcast so many different types of games, there must be a lot of research that goes into that. I was just wondering how you are able to do that with the seasons being quick. As you said, some seasons are really quick. It must be hard to catch up on the last seasons of the last teams.
A lot of the job is on a day-to-day basis. It's become so much easier because of social media where you can keep up on the news without necessarily having to go to any particular website where you can have it all curated through. For me, I use Twitter as a great news aggregator to be able to do that stuff.
I love Twitter.
Going back to the NCAA wrestling tournament, it's the same weekend as the opening rounds of the NCAA men's basketball tournament. So my timeline can be flooded with all these basketball tweets. What I did was I separate out all the wrestling accounts I follow into a Twitter list so I could just see those tweets without anything else that wasn't relevant to me for those 3 days. But the prep is really an ongoing process of starting before a game and trying to watch the team's previous game or games if you can, and doing as much research as you can on the players. Getting to talk to coaches and players is always great for additional insight. I never feel like I'm done preparing for a game. When I sit down and the ball is tipped or kicked or the first pitch is thrown, whatever the case might be, I always feel like there's something that I forgot, even if I didn't. That's just the way that my brain works, is that I always feel like there's something more that I could know. And then it comes down to it, and you don't use a majority of your information because the game turns out to be good and you're talking with the analyst and there's a lot of great stuff that the production team has put together. But for me, I always want to have as much information at my fingertips as I possibly can. So this past weekend, I was asked to fill in for Beth Mowens on a college softball game with Jessica Mendoza and Michelle Smith, which was a tremendous honor for me. And the morning of the game, I woke up and I put together a recap and kind of standings and updates on all the conferences around the country. So I went ACC, Big 10, Big 12, SEC, Pac-12, and kind of gave myself a national snapshot. I used one item from that took me a couple of hours to prepare for, but it's always better to have more rather than less to be able to go in any direction, because that's the fun of games, right? It's why we love them, because we never know what direction things are going to go in.
Right.
And so football is definitely the most time consuming to prepare for because there are just simply more players. And basketball takes a little bit less time. But they're all fun in their own way because I love finding out stories about players and being able to tell those on the air and finding what's new with teams and what's interesting and what will make the broadcast captivating for people watching at home.
Actually, I do have one last minute thought. This popped in my head. you obviously, we all, everyone who's covered a game or called a game in the last 2 years has most likely experienced something called the remote broadcast. What was that like for you?
I was very nervous with the first one that I did because I had only gotten my equipment set up the very same day of the game. And so the quality of your connection depends on the strength of your internet speed. And so I wasn't sure if my internet was going to be up to the task, basically. And if the game is coming in choppy, well, you can't really call it that well. Now, thankfully, that didn't end up being an issue. But it was also a Pac-12 after dark game, and I live in the Eastern time zone. And so it was super late. The game didn't kick off until 10 Eastern. It was Utah and Oregon State. And it was my first time calling a football game off a monitor. So my biggest concern was, am I going to be able to identify players in the way that I need to? I'm used to when I'm calling a football game, I've got my binoculars and I'm up in the press box and I'm keeping a really close eye on things. And I was nervous about hearing my analyst in a timely fashion and making sure they could hear me. So there were a lot of things that were on my mind going into that game. It ended up being okay. And then this past season, I did a lot of my football season from home, and it works out okay. It's definitely a joint effort between the camera crew and the director and the producer and the people calling the game, because let's say, there's where it comes into play the most is there's a 3rd and 1 and the team runs the ball and there's a big pile of 22 bodies and you can't tell if they got the first down. So normally if you're in the press box, you can see, all right, they're either lining up to go for it or they're going to punt. So one of the things that we talk about before the game is to say, all right, well, please make sure that when it's a close play like that, are they going to go for it on 4th down, that you're shooting the line of scrimmage, where in a normal broadcast, you might see the coach who's really mulling it over and has a very stern and serious face. So there's just small adjustments like that when it comes to broadcasting from home that make a difference. But it's definitely a new frontier for everybody. And I think something that we'll see stick around for quite some time.
I was going to say, do you think going forward next, however long your career does last, do you see yourself doing like a 50-50 kind of split, or do you see things going back from either, like 90-10, where 90 you're on site, or even like 100-0?
I think any prediction that I make will probably be worthless, because if you had asked me in 2019 or even January of 2020, will you ever call a game from home? The answer would have been 100% no. We will always go to the game. So I think it'll stick around in some form or fashion. As far as a proportion of home and away, it's really impossible to be able to say.
Yeah.
But I think from a financial standpoint, it certainly saves money, and so everybody in the last couple of years has been trying to tighten their belts, and every company is doing it because they've realized the production quality is very similar, and if we don't have to fly people, especially if you're doing, it's been the standard for international soccer for a really long time to do games remotely, because if you don't have to fly halfway around the world and you can still broadcast a game, then it makes sense to do that.
That's why I'm wondering, with the World Cup looming in a few months, are we going to see announcers in Qatar, or are we going to see announcers at a studio or in Los Angeles or something? So that's something that at least I will be keeping my eye on. But anyway, Mike, thank you for taking the time. This is going to conclude this episode of the Sports Saga podcast. For Tyler Clark, Dylan Johnston making his debut, and the ever versatile Mike Couzens, I'm Brady Kudo. Thanks so much for tuning in, and enjoy your day.